Today, we're jumping right into a huge geopolitical crisis that honestly pushed the Western world right to the edge. It's a story about a massive, icy island that's loaded with resources and strategic importance. It's about a U.S. president who would not back down, and an alliance of nations that suddenly started to question everything it stood for. Yep, we're breaking down the Greenland crisis. And it all really boiled over with this social media post in January 2026. I mean, you can't get much clearer than that. It was totally unambiguous, definitive, and aimed squarely at America's closest allies. President Trump was making it known the United States was going to acquire Greenland, one way or another. And really, that's the big question we're tackling. This whole thing wasn't just some minor diplomatic disagreement. No, this was a full-blown showdown that threatened to completely unravel decades of Western security cooperation. So how on earth did we get here? Okay, let's get into it. To really understand why things exploded in 2026, we've got to look back a little. Because this crisis, it didn't just pop up out of thin air. It was really the final step in a long-held presidential ambition for this incredibly strategic island. So if you look at how this played out, the idea of buying Greenland was first floated way back in his first term. Denmark pretty much laughed it off, but the idea, it never really died. It popped back up in his second-term inauguration speech, and then things got serious with the appointment of a special envoy. By January 2026, what a lot of people once dismissed as just a weird idea had escalated into a massive international confrontation that nobody could ignore. Now, what's so interesting here is how all of this aggressive foreign policy was playing back home, because while the president was dead set on this, the American public, well, as you're about to see, they had a very, very different take on using force to expand U.S. territory. A survey from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs around that time was just crystal clear. A staggering 85% of Americans were against the most extreme option on the table, a military invasion to just take Greenland. There was basically zero public support for it. And this wasn't just about Greenland, you know. That same survey found that 81% of Americans were against the whole principle of using military force just to get another country's natural resources. It shows this really deep-seated feeling against going to war for purely economic reasons. And if you zoom out even more, 70% of the public said it was unacceptable to use the military for regime change, to install a government that was more friendly to the U.S. So what you're seeing here is a picture of a public that was really uncomfortable with the kind of interventionist policy the administration was pushing. In this chart, wow, it really breaks down the politics of it all. So while, big majorities across the board thought forcibly taking territory was unacceptable, you can see a pretty big partisan gap. 69% of Republicans thought it was unacceptable, but look at the Democrats, 93%. That gap shows that the president's rhetoric was definitely finding a more welcome, though still minority audience inside his own party. Okay, so let's shift over to the international reaction. Because it was fast, it was united, and people were seriously alarmed. For European leaders, this wasn't just a simple disagreement. They saw it as a direct attack on the entire international order that had been built since World War II. Over at the World Economic Forum in Davos, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, he did not hold back. He framed the American demand in these really sharp historical terms, calling it new colonialism and a choice of brutality over the rule of law. Strong stuff. And then you have Belgium's Prime Minister, Bart de Wever, who I think just perfectly captured the existential fear that was ripping through the alliance. I mean, the whole point of NATO is to defend each other. So what happens when the threat is coming from your most powerful member? He's straight up warned that 80 years of the transatlantic security alliance could be over. And this wasn't just tough talk. In what was a really incredible show of unity, a bunch of European countries, France, Germany, the UK, the Nordics, they all sent troops to Greenland. Now, the official story was a military exercise called Operation Arctic Endurance. But unofficially, everyone saw it as a tripwire force. It was a clear, unmistakable signal to Washington: if you make an aggressive move against Denmark, you're facing a united Europe. So here's the bottom line. This whole thing went way beyond a fight over an island. It struck right at the heart of NATO, and it backed European leaders into a strategically impossible corner. See, for years, Europe had been trying to manage its relationship with the Trump administration using a strategy some people called strategic acquiescence. Basically, the idea was to build up their own defenses, help Ukraine, and publicly praise the president on things like defense spending, all just to keep that U.S. security guarantee in place against threats like Russia. Well, the Greenland crisis just blew that whole strategy to pieces. I mean, think about the dilemma. On one hand, Europe was desperate to keep the alliance going to handle Russia and support Ukraine. But on the other hand, they were now staring down a direct threat to the territory of a fellow NATO member from their main protector. It just didn't compute. It was a complete contradiction. And that brings us right to the core problem. The entire NATO alliance is built on this one idea, Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all. But the people who wrote that treaty, they never imagined a situation where the most powerful member would be the one threatening to attack another. It's a question that just shook the alliance to its very foundations. So all of this chaos, all of this strategic tension, it all came to a head at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. The entire world was watching as this diplomatic and economic showdown, one that could literally reshape the global order, was about to go down. And the Trump administration pulled out its favorite tool, tariffs. A threat went out to 8 key European nations. And by the way, these were the same countries that sent troops for Operation Arctic Endurance. The message was simple. Drop your objections or face tariffs starting at 10% and quickly rising to 25%. But Europe wasn't powerless. They had some pretty heavy-duty tools of their own, and leaders started talking seriously about hitting back. We're talking about suspending a massive EU-US trade deal, and for the first time ever, using something called the anti-coercion instrument, a powerful new tool designed specifically to counter economic bullying. That would let them block U.S. access to everything from public contracts to digital services. It was risking a full-scale trade war. That showdown in Davos put the entire Western alliance on a razor's edge. And while, the immediate economic fight was eventually avoided, the damage was already done. It forced every single member of the alliance to ask themselves a really uncomfortable question, one that still hangs in the air today. If an alliance can't even protect you from its strongest member, what is it really for?